Every documentary tells you Edward VIII gave up the throne for love. That sentence has been repeated so many times, it has acquired the smooth, worn quality of a stone on a riverbed. Something people step over without thinking about it anymore. They just move along. It sounds romantic. It's designed to sound romantic. And it leaves out the part that changes everything. Edward didn't simply give up a crown. He gave up responsibility. He gave up duty. He gave up the daily administrative work of being the constitutional head of an empire, the state papers, the diplomatic obligations, the endless cycle of public appearances and official openings and careful, politically neutral symbolic labor that the institution required. He escaped. He called it sacrifice. Then everyone spent the next 80 years choosing who to blame for the mess he left behind. And they chose the American woman standing beside him. Wallis Simpson was genuinely difficult. History hasn't been wrong about that, only about what it proves. She was domineering, socially aggressive, twice divorced, American, and she moved through the English court as though she had already won. Edward's own authorized biographer, Philip Ziegler, writing with access to the family papers, described her as harsh, dominating, often abominably rude. She treated the prince at the best like a child. Contemporary accounts placed her seizing the carving knife from Edward's hands at his own dinner table because she thought he was doing it wrong, in front of his household. A woman who takes a carving knife from a king at his own table and finishes the job herself isn't a sympathetic figure. She wasn't trying to be. But the problem with Edward VIII didn't begin the day he met Wallis Simpson. The problem was there long before she walked into Fort Belvedere, long before she existed in his life at all. His father knew it. His government knew it. His authorized biographer documented it in meticulous, embarrassing detail across 700 pages. Wallis didn't make Edward dangerous. She made it impossible for the palace to keep pretending he wasn't. And when the pretending collapsed, the institution needed someone to hand the burden to. She was available. She was foreign. She was female. She fit. Wallis Simpson became the villain because blaming her was easier than admitting Edward VIII was unfit for the throne before she ever arrived. That is what the evidence actually proves. Begin in 1934. George V is still reigning, still watching his eldest son with the particular resigned anxiety of a father who can see exactly what's coming and knows he can't stop it. Edward, known in the family as David, is 40 years old, handsome, celebrated throughout the empire as a modern prince with the common touch, and has been the Prince of Wales for over 20 years. He hasn't married, he hasn't settled. He hasn't done the things that heirs to the British throne are supposed to do. That year, George V said something to Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin that he had clearly been thinking for a long time. The attribution is solid, sourced to Keith Middlemiss and John Barnes's authorized biography of Baldwin, published in 1969. And consistent across subsequent accounts. What George V told Baldwin was, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. Not, I have some concerns. Not, I worry he may face difficulties. After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. The old king said it with the certainty of a man who had spent decades watching someone make the same mistake in slightly different forms. George V died January 20th, 1936. Edward abdicated December 10th, 1936. His reign lasted 324 days. His father had given him a year. He didn't quite make it. The king who made that prediction wasn't reacting to a sudden surprise. He had been watching the accumulation for decades. By 1919, Queen Mary was already privately lamenting her son's growing disdain for duty and his infatuation with married socialites. And Wallis was still in America, still married to her first husband, still completely unknown to the English court. The concern predated her by a decade. Throughout the 1920s, Edward was developing a reputation within political and court circles that had nothing to do with romantic attachment, and everything to do with who he actually was when the tours ended and the cameras went away. Picture what those tours look like from the inside. Enormous crowds lined the streets of Wellington and Melbourne and Johannesburg. Young women pressed forward to touch him. Newspapers across the Commonwealth ran the same photograph: the Prince of Wales, boyish, charming, seemingly tireless, leaning into a crowd of miners or veterans or factory workers with what appeared to be genuine concern. The image was real enough in its way. Edward did feel something for the working men he met. That part wasn't entirely invented. But back inside the residences, behind the closed doors of whatever great house had been lent for the occasion, the portrait changed. He drank. He danced through the small hours. He complained about the official schedule with the persistence of a man who genuinely believed that complaining might change it. He wrote long, private letters to a married woman in London, a woman named Frida Dudley Ward, who functioned in his emotional life as something between a confessor and a substitute mother. The correspondence lasted 16 years. He called her Mommy. He wrote that the monarchy was a thing of the past and his father was out of touch. He wrote that he felt quite ready to commit suicide and would, if I didn't think it unfair to Papa. These are the private words of the man the world's press was constructing as Prince Charming, a construction he later acknowledged with more honesty than he perhaps intended. All my life I had been the passive clay which it had enthusiastically worked into the hackneyed image of Prince Charming. Philip Ziegler, working from the official family archives, described Edward's private letters as reading like the diary of a middle schooler who never mastered the English language, and noted that his public pronouncements rarely aspired to the banal. At Oxford, Edward wrote home that the lectures were very hard to understand, and I don't think I shall go anymore. He was the heir to the British throne, enrolled at university. He decided the lectures were difficult and declined to attend. That is the intellectual register in which he operated. The duty avoidance was consistent and documented. Civil servants who worked alongside him noted he was indifferent to his kin and bored by the official elements of his role. Those in political proximity described him as lazy and erratic, with a negligent attitude towards his duties. Baldwin had already told colleagues he doubted Edward would stay the course, and none of this was sparked by a woman named Wallis Warfield from Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. It was sparked by Edward himself, reliably over decades, whenever the structure of the institution pressed against his personality. His political conduct as Prince of Wales raised separate alarms. He publicly referred to Labour county councillors as cranks. He made speeches that ran contrary to government policy. When he visited devastated mining communities in South Wales and declared, "Something must be done," the phrase that briefly made him a hero to Labour voters and a concern to everyone responsible for keeping the Crown out of politics, Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald wrote in his diary that it was an invasion into the field of politics, and urged that these escapades should be limited. Edward had been given a symbolic role. The role required him to appear to care without actually influencing anything. He kept trying to collapse the distinction between appearing to care and doing something about it, but only on his own terms, and only when it suited him personally. Then, January 20th, 1936, George V died, and the problem became constitutional. Edward was now king. The careful management of his public persona, The press agreements, the diplomatic silences, the courtier workarounds suddenly had to operate at a different level. And almost immediately, the infrastructure began to strain. As king, he opposed League of Nations sanctions on fascist Italy after its invasion of Ethiopia, directly contrary to government policy. He refused to receive the deposed Emperor Haile Selassie. He declined to support strengthening the League of Nations. The Foreign Secretary's briefings were interrupted by a prime minister who was becoming preoccupied with a different kind of problem entirely. Then there was Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. In the summer of 1936, a new wing had been built. The king was invited to open it. He declined, citing mourning for his father George V, who had died in January. Plausible, if the dates weren't slightly awkward. The following day he appeared in newspaper photographs, on holiday, outdoors, cheerful. The infirmary opening was delegated to his brother Albert, Duke of York, the same brother who had the same deceased father, who had the same grounds to claim mourning, if mourning were the actual reason. Edward had claimed grief to avoid a public engagement, and then delegated the work to the one person whose grounds for the same excuse were identical to his. The hypocrisy was specific enough to be almost elegant. By autumn 1936, something worse was happening with the state papers. Foreign Office officials noticed that documents arriving at Edward's residence bore no evidence of being read. More alarming, papers specifically concerning Germany's military buildup were going missing from the royal correspondence. Officials began quietly screening the king's state papers before they reached him, removing documents about Germany's rearmament from the royal mailbox. Whatever the explanation, carelessness, indiscretion, something more troubling, the action taken in response was without precedent. The government was editing the intelligence reaching its own monarch because they couldn't be certain what happened to the documents afterward. By the point Wallis Simpson entered the constitutional picture, the government had already concluded it couldn't trust the king with sensitive foreign policy information. That conclusion had been reached on the basis of his behavior, not hers. Edward first met Wallis in the early 1930s, introduced by his current mistress, Lady Thelma Furness, at Borough Court near Melton Mowbray. Furness was going to New York for several weeks and asked Wallis to keep the prince company in her absence. It was the specific kind of mistake that looks obvious in retrospect and invisible at the time. Bessie Wallace Warfield had been born June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. Her father died when she was an infant, leaving her and her mother dependent on the charity of wealthier relatives. She grew up knowing the difference between the family that had money and the family she belonged to, and that knowledge produced in her a ferocious social intelligence and a driving hunger to never be financially precarious again. At the Oldfield School in Maryland, her uncle's money paying the fees, a fellow pupil recalled, "She was bright, brighter than all of us. She made up her mind to go to the head of the class, and she did." She married Win Spencer, a U.S. Navy pilot, in November 1916. He was a heavy drinker, possibly physically abusive. By 1922, they were permanently separated. Her first divorce was finalized in 1927. She married Ernest Simpson, an Anglo-American shipping executive, in 1928, and moved to London. By the early 1930s, she was throwing dinner parties that became known for their food, their conversation, and for a hostess who had the unusual gift of concentrating her attention on whoever she was speaking to so completely that they remembered it for years afterward. Future novelist Barbara Cartland described her as aggressively American, said she told rather vulgar stories, and claimed to have been shocked to the core. The shock was real. So was the fascination. Philip Ziegler, in the authorized biography, noted that by the end of 1934, Edward had become slavishly dependent on Wallis, his word, and that she was domineering in ways that went beyond social aggression. She took over dinner table duties from him. She corrected him in company. She organized his residence at Fort Belvedere with an efficiency that suggested she found his management of it inadequate. What Ziegler also noted, more carefully, was that their relationship had sadomasochistic elements, and that Edward relished the contempt and bullying she bestowed on him. The authorized biographer was describing a dynamic in which the man who needed a king to not need anyone was finding in Wallis's dominance exactly the kind of management he had always sought from women, from Freda Dudley Ward, who had been his little mummy for 16 years, to Thelma Furness, who had encouraged his most selfish behavior, to Wallis, who treated him like a child and got the absolute obedience in return. The establishment's objections to Wallis as a prospective queen were real and multiple, and worth taking seriously, because the argument that she was a scapegoat only holds if we are honest about what she actually was. She was American, at a moment when considerable segments of the British aristocracy regarded Americans with a disdain they didn't bother to modulate. Neville Chamberlain, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, noted in his diary that she was entirely unscrupulous, not genuinely in love with the king, but exploiting him for personal advantage. Joseph Kennedy, the American ambassador, called her a tart. His wife, Rose, refused to sit at the same dinner table. She was perceived, in the phrase of the time, as a woman of limitless ambition, a gold digger with royal-level ambitions and the social intelligence to pursue them. Her legal position was genuinely complicated. Her first divorce, obtained in the United States on grounds of emotional incompatibility, wasn't recognized by the Church of England and might not have survived challenge in English courts. This meant that in ecclesiastical terms, her subsequent marriages could be considered bigamous, including any marriage to the king. When the crisis peaked in December 1936, she was still in the process of divorcing Ernest Simpson. Her decree nisi had been granted October 27th. The absolute decree wouldn't be final until May 1937. She would bring 2 living ex-husbands to any marriage with the king, which was canonically untenable for a sovereign who was constitutionally required to serve as supreme governor of a church that had reaffirmed in 1935 that in no circumstances can Christian men or women remarry during the lifetime of a wife or a husband. She gave the establishment every instrument it needed. The real question, never satisfactorily examined in the romance narrative, is whether those instruments were used to address the constitutional problem or to absorb the attention that might otherwise have been directed at a more difficult truth about the king himself. What the documented record actually shows about Wallis's position during the crisis complicates the villain's story further. Wallis's solicitor, John Goddard, later stated that his client was ready to do anything to ease the situation, that she was prepared to end the relationship to prevent the catastrophe, but that the other end of the wicket was determined. Edward told her directly, "You can go wherever you want, to China or Labrador or the South Seas, but wherever you go, he would follow." She was pressed to stay by a man who wouldn't release her. The pressure from so insistent a lover, one contemporary account noted, was already almost more than Wallis could cope with. She fled to the south of France as the crisis broke in December 1936, taking up siege in a villa near Caen. There, she was pressured by Lord Brownlow, the king's lord-in-waiting, to renounce Edward publicly. She drafted a statement indicating readiness to give him up. Edward's response was to push harder. That negotiation, a woman trying to extract herself from a man who wouldn't let her, never featured in the romance. October 20th, 1936. Fort Belvedere sits in Windsor Great Park, a castellated folly of a house, impractical and theatrical in equal measure, with battlements and turrets and, as Lady Diana Cooper once observed, an absence of the 50 red soldiers that would make it look like a toy. Edward loved it. It suited him. It looked like the real thing without requiring the actual weight of it. Baldwin drove out to Fort Belvedere at Edward's own request, sat in the drawing room, and asked the king to be more discreet about his relationship with Mrs. Simpson. Nothing was resolved. What followed over the next 7 weeks wasn't the story of a romantic king being cornered by a hostile government. It was the story of a man running his own constitutional crisis on his own timeline with his own strategy, making every significant decision himself. November 16th, 1936. Edward invites Baldwin to Fort Belvedere. It's the king who has requested this meeting. He tells the prime minister he intends to marry Wallis Simpson as soon as she is free to do so. Baldwin explains, as plainly as constitutional convention allows, that such a marriage would be unacceptable. The Queen of England becomes the queen of the country, he says. In the choice of a queen, the voice of the people must be heard. And then Edward responds with words that Baldwin recorded and that survived in the official account. I intend to marry Mrs. Simpson as soon as she is free to marry. If the government opposed the marriage, as the Prime Minister had given me reason to believe it would, then I was prepared to go. He said he was prepared to go. Not Baldwin, not the church, not the dominions. Edward VIII, on November 16, 1936, in a private meeting he had requested, told his prime minister he was prepared to abdicate the throne. He introduced the option. He put it on the table. The story in which Edward was pushed has survived because he later said, I found it impossible, which is passive, which sounds like something done to him. The record from November 16th shows the exact opposite. He named the outcome himself. 9 days later, November 25th, he proposed a morganatic marriage, a constitutional mechanism with no precedent in British history. The idea was that Parliament would pass specific legislation enabling Wallis to be his wife without the position of queen. Their potential children would be excluded from the succession. This wasn't a passive suggestion. It required parliamentary action. It required Dominion agreement. It required the Church to accommodate something the Church had explicitly refused to accommodate 3 weeks earlier. Proposing it was an act of active constitutional maneuvering. The man who had written off Oxford lectures as too difficult was now devising parliamentary strategies. His own advisor, Lord Beaverbrook, warned him clearly. By posing the morganatic question to the government in the way he had, Edward was constitutionally bound to accept their answer. Edward knew this. He proposed it anyway, expecting, or hoping, that public sentiment might override constitutional convention. The 5 dominions were consulted over the following days. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State were each asked whether they would accept either a full royal marriage or the morganatic arrangement. Every major dominion opposed both. Canada's Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, responded in terms that were a polite way of saying the Canadian government wouldn't be supporting him either. Baldwin delivered the composite verdict on December 2nd. Every route was formally closed. December 3rd, 1936. Edward proposed broadcasting directly to the British public via BBC Radio. Picture what this would have required. A sitting king, over the explicit objection of his prime minister, delivers an address to his subjects designed to generate public pressure on the elected government. pressure sufficient, he hoped, to force a reversal of ministerial advice. The speech text, as it was being drafted, would have left open the possibility that Edward might remain on the throne or be recalled to it pending a resolution, which meant he was planning to use the emotional power of the monarchy as a weapon against the constitutional settlement that constrained it. Beaverbrook backed the plan. Churchill backed the plan. Baldwin blocked it. Edward's own ministers concluded the proposed broadcast revealed his disdainful attitude towards constitutional conventions and threatened the political neutrality of the crown. By the afternoon of December 3, 1936, German troops were moving in Spain. Hitler and Mussolini were formalizing their alliance, and the British Prime Minister was fielding proposals from his king to go on the wireless and appeal to popular sentiment in defiance of ministerial advice. Baldwin's Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, had not briefed the Prime Minister on European affairs in 3 months. Eden's account of trying to bring Baldwin current on the Spanish arms embargo was interrupted when he realized Baldwin had stopped listening. He was preoccupied with newspaper clippings about Edward and Wallis and the worldwide scandal surrounding the British Crown. The government's bandwidth was being consumed by a constitutional crisis that Edward had been actively driving toward the edge. December 5th. Edward notified Baldwin of his decision to abdicate. December 10th, at Fort Belvedere, in the same turret and battlements folly where so many of the decisions had been made, he signed the instrument of abdication. His 3 younger brothers, Albert, Henry, and George, were summoned to witness the signing. Albert wrote in his diary afterward that he sobbed like a child at his mother's house the following day when he told her what had happened. Parliament passed the Abdication Act with royal assent on December 11th at 1:52 in the afternoon. That evening, Edward delivered the radio address that became the myth. He had been introduced as His Royal Highness Prince Edward, already stripped of the title that had defined him, and he said, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility, and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." It's a perfect sentence. It's structured as a declaration of love. What it actually contains is a confession of incapacity. I have found it impossible. Wrapped in the vocabulary of romance so completely that generations of listeners heard sacrifice instead of failure. His father had predicted this. His biographer documented this. His ministers had observed it for years. He found a way to say, "I couldn't do it," that made the world hear, "I loved too deeply." The reframe worked. It has been working ever since. Albert Frederick Arthur George Windsor had spent his entire adult life in his elder brother's shadow, and the shadow was considerable. The crowds who lined the streets for Edward's tours didn't line them for Albert. The newspapers didn't run his photograph. He had come last, 68th out of 68, and then, in a different accounting, last out of 98, in naval examination standings. He stammered so severely that public speaking was genuine physiological ordeal. The stammer had been with him since childhood. He managed it only through years of intensive work with Lionel Logue, an Australian-born speech therapist who began treating him in 1925 and whose diaries, published decades later, document session by session what it cost Bertie to produce speech that the world expected to come naturally to a king. On December 11th, 1936, he became George VI. He took the regnal name deliberately, to emphasize continuity with his father, to signal stability after a year of disorder. The day he signed the accession documents, the Parliament of the Irish Free State removed all mention of the monarch from the Irish Constitution. The Dominions had watched a king spend 11 months undermining his own position, and were assessing what followed. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had married Albert, Duke of York, in 1923. She had turned down his proposal twice before accepting, reportedly because she was reluctant to accept the permanent loss of privacy that came with the royal family. The woman who would become the most dangerous woman in Europe, according to Hitler's reported assessment, had initially been reluctant to join the institution at all. By 1936, she had settled fully into her role, and she had formed her view of Wallis Simpson before the abdication crisis ever began. One account dates the rupture specifically. In 1935, at Fort Belvedere, Edward's residence in Windsor Great Park, the Duchess of York walked into the drawing room to find Wallis performing an imitation of her. It was described as particularly cruel and vindictive. Wallis capturing the Duchess's Scottish-inflected cadences, her manner, her bearing, in a way that left no ambiguity about the intent. A guest present that afternoon, Brigadier Oliver Hogg's wife, Ella, later said that, from the moment of overhearing, the Duchess of York became her implacable enemy. Whether or not the single-source account of that specific afternoon is precise in every detail, the general trajectory it describes is confirmed across multiple independent witnesses. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had formed an implacable position toward Wallis Simpson, and the abdication calcified it into something institutional. She referred to Wallis in private as "that woman" for the rest of her life, a formulation so consistent across independent accounts that it appears to have been a deliberate verbal choice, a way of declining to acknowledge Wallis's name or title as legitimate. In a letter to Queen Mary, written at some point in the run-up to the abdication, she described Wallis as a naughty lady and noted that relations are already a little difficult when naughty ladies are brought in. The most striking documented statement attributed to her in direct speech came later. The two people who have caused me the most trouble in my life are Wallis Simpson and Hitler. That she ranked an American socialite alongside the architect of the Holocaust tells you the depth of the emotional attribution, whatever it says about the proportionality. To Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Wallis Simpson was the reason her husband had been handed a throne neither he nor she had wanted, and she held that accounting with an intensity that didn't diminish over time. William Shawcross, authorized to write the official biography of the Queen Mother and given access to her private papers at Windsor, reportedly moderated his account of her feelings toward Wallis. Critical accounts of the biography describe Shawcross as repeatedly pulling his punches on the subject of her anguish over her nemesis. If an authorized biographer working with the private papers felt the need to soften the record, the unmoderated version must have been sharper than anything he published. Journalist Michael Thornton, who spent time with both camps at different points, recorded what the Windsors told him in 1971 from their Paris mansion in the Bois de Boulogne. The Duke's assessment of his sister-in-law, with the qualification that he couldn't be quoted, followed immediately by the quote, "Behind that great abundance of charm is a shrewd, scheming, and extremely ruthless woman." The Duchess, with no such qualification. "She will never permit it. Not until the day we die. When we are dead, perhaps she may at last forgive us." When asked the reason for the implacable opposition, Wallis's arm shot out toward the door. "Jealousy," she said. "Jealousy of the Duke? No, jealousy of me for having married him." Whether that explanation captures the truth or reveals the blind spot of a woman who never fully grasped what she represented to the institution, the ferocity behind it was real. George VI died February 6, 1952, at age 56. The official cause was coronary thrombosis. The medical picture is more specific: bronchial carcinoma of the left lung, diagnosed September 1951, requiring a left pneumonectomy performed by Sir Clement Price Thomas. He had smoked 2 or more packets of cigarettes daily since age 16, for 4 decades. Peripheral vascular disease affecting his legs had been documented since 1948. The direct medical cause of his early death was his smoking history and its cumulative consequences. No documented statement from Elizabeth Bowes Lyon explicitly identifies Wallis Simpson as the cause of George VI's death, because the cause was lung cancer from 40 years of heavy smoking. What she blamed Wallis for was the abdication, the unwanted throne, the sustained burden of a role Bertie had never prepared for and never wanted. Her grief was real. Her emotional logic was internally coherent. But the causal chain from abdication stress to early death from bronchial carcinoma runs through medical evidence that points primarily somewhere else. Elizabeth believed it anyway, with the conviction of a woman who had watched her husband carry something he should never have been asked to carry. And she held that attribution for 50 years with the authority of the most beloved public figure in Britain. What that sustained authority produced institutionally was the hardening of a particular narrative into something close to settled fact. Within the palace, within the family, within the cultural space the Queen Mother occupied, the question of who was responsible had been answered. Wallis had done it. The investigation was closed. That conclusion was transmitted, not by explicit instruction, but by the weight of her presence. The way the institution organized itself around her grief, the way junior family members learned what it meant to bring Wallis's name up in the wrong company. In June 1937, Edward and Wallis married at Château de Condé in France's Loire Valley. The chateau belonged to Charles Bedaux, a Franco-American industrialist who would be arrested by the United States during the war on suspicion of intelligence work for Germany. Bedaux arranged the ceremony. He also arranged what followed. In October 1937, 10 months after leaving the British throne, just 4 months into a marriage he had declared the reason for leaving it, the Duke of Windsor toured Nazi Germany for 12 days. The visit was explicitly against the advice of the British government. German officials had meticulously planned the itinerary to showcase National Socialist social welfare programs in the most favorable possible light. The tour was, as the historical record plainly shows, a propaganda exercise in which the Duke and Duchess of Windsor served as the most symbolically useful foreign visitors the Nazi government could have obtained. On October 22, 1937, the Duke met Adolf Hitler at his Berghof retreat on the Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps. In the preceding days, the Windsors had dined with Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Albert Speer. On at least one occasion during the tour, the Duke appears to have given a version of the Nazi salute. The Duchess's own recorded response to the schedule: mortally boring. That characterization suggests Wallis found the propaganda exercise tedious, the reaction of someone enduring an obligation, rather than pursuing an enthusiasm. Edward's disposition wasn't so ambivalent. The evidence about Edward's political sympathies must be handled precisely, because the available material breaks into distinct tiers that carry different epistemic weight. The documented associations are uncontested. The 1937 Germany tour happened. The Hitler meeting happened. The dinners with senior Nazi officials happened. These are independently confirmed across multiple historical sources and require no interpretation. The documented statements form a second, more contextualized tier. In July 1933, in a conversation with a grandson of the former Kaiser Wilhelm II, Edward reportedly told Prince Louis Ferdinand that it was no business of ours to interfere in Germany's internal affairs, either re-Jews or re-anything else, and added that dictators are very popular these days, and that we might want one in England before long. This attribution appears in the account of Paul R. Sweet, who served as chief American editor of the German Foreign Policy Documents series from 1952 to 1958, a scholarly source with direct access to the contemporaneous German Foreign Ministry archives, drawing on records compiled at the time by German officials. In November 1936, diarist Sir Henry Channon recorded that Edward was going the dictator way and is pro-German, against Russia, and against too much slipshod democracy. These aren't post-war assessments. They are what informed contemporaries were writing in private while the events were happening. The intelligence assessments form a third tier, material that reflects what professional intelligence services believed, rather than what they could prove. In the summer of 1940, as France fell and the Windsors made their way to Lisbon, German intelligence mounted Operation Willy, an organized effort to prevent the Duke from sailing to the Bahamas, possibly involving scenarios ranging from persuasion to physical detention. German dispatches recorded, as assessment rather than established fact, that the Duke believed continued severe bombing would make England ready for peace, and was considering public statements distancing himself from Churchill's war policy. Churchill threatened court-martial when the Windsors delayed in Lisbon. He dispatched Walter Monckton, Edward's old friend and legal advisor from the abdication crisis, to Portugal specifically to get them on the boat. They sailed August 1, 1940, with a German SS team reportedly still in position nearby. Whether Edward was a genuine ideological sympathizer with National Socialism, a naive man flattered by the attention of powerful figures, a bitter exile who found German warmth considerably more agreeable than British coldness, or some combination of all three, historians have debated this legitimately and without conclusive resolution. What isn't debated is that his conduct required years of active containment, and that the containment effort extended well beyond the war's end. When Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945 and more than 400 tons of foreign ministry archives were assembled at Marburg Castle, a bound volume of documents concerning the Duke of Windsor's wartime communications attracted immediate concern. The British government's campaign to suppress those documents, the Windsor File, was documented in meticulous detail by Paul R. Sweet, who was inside the editorial operation. Churchill led the effort. He wrote to the then Prime Minister Clement Attlee that the document's publication might do the greatest possible harm, and earnestly trusted that all traces of these German intrigues would be destroyed. Attlee agreed. The State Department declined to destroy the American copy. Over the next 8 years, British officials made repeated attempts to prevent publication, requests to destroy microfilm, direct instructions passed through the State Department that the editors must omit the Windsor material, pressure applied at the highest diplomatic levels. The American editors resisted. One threatened resignation. The Windsor File was eventually published in Volume 10 of the Documents on German Foreign Policy series. Churchill, who had been Edward's strongest public supporter during the abdication crisis in 1936, became the man who worked hardest to prevent the documentation of his wartime conduct from reaching historians. That isn't the behavior of a government embarrassed by an eccentric. It's the behavior of a government managing a risk it considered serious. The Wallis as villain story didn't survive for 80 years by accident. It survived because it served multiple powerful interests simultaneously, and those interests were so naturally aligned that the narrative required almost no maintenance. It ran on its own momentum. It protected the institution. A monarchy is a more stable thing when the crisis it narrowly survived is remembered as a romantic tragedy than when it's described accurately. A constitutionally reckless king with documented sympathies toward autocratic governance, whose government had to suppress his intelligence file for nearly a decade, was removed from the throne by the combined pressure of his prime minister, the Church of England, and the collective constitutional machinery of 5 dominions. The love story is an institutional asset. The accurate version is an institutional liability. Institutions don't choose the version that damages them. It protected a pattern as old as public life, in which male failure is externalized onto female figures. Edward made a series of active decisions from October to December 1936. He pressured his government. He proposed a morganatic arrangement. He planned a radio broadcast to override his ministers. He introduced abdication as an option himself on November 16th. When those decisions had consequences, the explanation that took hold reached for the woman beside him. Scheming was available as a description for Wallis. In love was available for Edward. Those 2 framings do considerable institutional work, and they have always done it. The scheming woman and the besotted man is a story structure with deep cultural roots, and it does not require anyone to deliberately deploy it. It operates automatically. It preserved a myth with genuine cultural power, the idea that at the apex of institutional obligation, human feeling can override duty, and that this is somehow ennobling rather than simply irresponsible. That story circulates below the level of argument. It doesn't need defending because it feels true to people who have never examined it. The felt truth has outlasted decades of scholarly correction, and it served Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's grief, which carried enormous institutional weight. She had watched her husband receive a throne he hadn't wanted and hadn't been prepared for, because his brother chose personal desire over constitutional responsibility. Her emotional logic was coherent. Wallis was the reason. She held that attribution for 50 years with the authority of the most beloved public figure in Britain. The palace organized itself around her grief. Her sustained public position on the matter, not stated, because she refused to speak about it publicly, but maintained through gesture, through protocol, through the 50 years of that woman, became the institution's settled understanding. The official biography softened it. The letters patent denied it. The coffin leaving Paris without the royal standard confirmed it. Each decision was small. Together they constitute a sustained institutional verdict, maintained long after everyone involved was gone. George VI stayed in London during the Blitz. He and Elizabeth visited bombed streets in Stepney and Whitechapel. Buckingham Palace itself was hit by the Luftwaffe, 9 times in total over the course of the war, with 2 bombs landing in the forecourt while the King and Queen were inside. Elizabeth reportedly told a friend that she was almost glad they had been bombed, because it meant she could look the East End in the face. Hitler's reported description of her, whether exactly phrased or slightly elaborated in transmission, was the most dangerous woman in Europe. Whatever precision that attribution carries, the picture it captures is accurate. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, in London, shooting at targets in the palace grounds in preparation for a possible German invasion, was the opposite of Edward Windsor in Nassau, managing a colonial posting designed to keep him safe and contained. Edward had sailed from Lisbon on August 1, 1940. Churchill had pushed for the earliest possible departure date, threatening court-martial to accelerate it. A German SS operation had been mounted in Portugal, specifically to prevent the Windsors' departure or exploit their presence. German intelligence, in its dispatches to Berlin, had assessed the Duke as a potential asset, possibly useful in the event of a German occupation of Britain, possibly as the face of a negotiated peace. Churchill was aware of the assessment. He managed the risk by putting Edward on a boat to the West Indies. George VI held the line his brother had abandoned. He remained in the palace. He stood in bombed streets beside the people his predecessor had told something must be done, and then done nothing about. He spoke on the radio, managing a stammer he had spent 15 years fighting, in a voice the nation needed to sound steady, on behalf of a country that required its monarch to be present and committed. He died February 6, 1952, at 56, of the diseases that had been accumulating in his body since he was 16 years old. His successor, his daughter Elizabeth, reigned for 70 years. What a King Edward VIII would have done during the Blitz belongs to the counterfactual category that historians treat with appropriate caution. But the documented record is sufficient without speculation. German intelligence considered him a potential asset worth a dedicated SS operation. His own government considered him a risk, requiring physical relocation to another hemisphere. His documented statements expressed admiration for autocratic governance and indifference to Jewish persecution. His intelligence file required years of suppression by a prime minister who had supported him publicly and privately concluded he was a danger. His wartime contrast with his brother does not require editorial enhancement to make the point. The abdication is remembered as Edward's sacrifice. The evidence supports a different description. It was the monarchy's narrowest possible escape, dressed in the language of romantic tragedy, and maintained in that costume by sustained institutional effort for the better part of a century. He didn't give up a throne for love. He escaped obligations he had never wanted for a woman who, by multiple accounts, had not fully wanted him to give them up. He called it sacrifice. His government called it constitutionally necessary. His brother called it sobbing like a child at his mother's house in the hours before he took the crown. His father had seen it coming 12 months before it arrived and said so to the Prime Minister in words that were accurate in every important particular. Wallis Simpson was difficult, transgressive, genuinely unacceptable to the establishment on grounds that weren't entirely invented. She was also, in the end, the explanation everyone reached for, because she was available. She was foreign, she was female, and she was legible as a villain in a story that needed one. She walked into a situation created entirely by the man she loved and spent the rest of her life, until her death in Paris on April 24, 1986, at age 89, carrying the responsibility for it. She was referred to as that woman by the Queen Mother from December 1936 until Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's own death in 2002. Her coffin left the Bois de Boulogne without the royal standard. Her gravestone at Frogmore bears no HRH. The punishment outlasted the crime, the principles, and the century. Edward had the abdication speech. He had the radio broadcast. He had The Woman I Love. He controlled the narrative from the moment he introduced abdication as an option on November 16th to the moment he framed it as sacrifice on December 11th. He always controlled the narrative. Wallis wore the blame because Edward had once worn the crown. If you want more stories the standard version left out, subscribe.